So now we'll look at the bones of the face, and we'll start with the maxilla bone. The maxilla refers to your upper jaw, but the bone extends all the way up the side of the nose. And I would remind you that, especially this model, I chose it to use for the video because it has very nice outlines of the lines between the individual bones. And some models don't have such distinct lines. But you would see a dividing line if this were a different set of bones, right? And then for emphasis here, I've got a blue version of the maxilla bone all by itself, so disarticulated from the skull, but with the teeth there. So the maxilla runs all the way up the side region of the nose and extends quite a bit laterally as well on the side of your cheek and meets the zygomatic bone that makes that cheekbone. Okay. The maxilla has a few features. The infraorbital foramen is this hole that is inferior to the orbit. So the orbit is your eye socket. Infraorbital foramen is this opening below the orbit, and that's exactly what the name means. Okay. Alveolar processes are the projections that extend out away from the maxilla bone in order to define the spaces where the teeth are embedded into the jaw. And so if I were to point between the teeth, those are your alveolar processes. And that term will be used the same in the lower jaw or mandible in just a minute. And then if I flip this skull model over and we look at the roof of the mouth, okay, the maxilla is the upper jawbone, and the palatine process, this word is palatine like your palate, this is called your hard palate in digestive terms, which is really made of portions of two different bones. So this portion is called the palatine process of the maxilla bone. And then there's also a maxillary sinus inside this bone, hollowed out inside this bone that's right in here. It's kind of a little pocket to the side of the nose and in the side of your cheek. And so here's the maxilla bone all by itself. Again, infraorbital foramen is this opening that would be below the orbit. The alveolar processes are the projections between the teeth. If I flip this bone over, it's a little easier to see why the roof of the mouth, when you take one bone by itself, is referred to as the palatine process. It is a projection that sticks out of the bone, a little easier to see when you look at the bone all by itself. And then this bone happens to show that pocket of the maxillary sinus. So this hollowed out space is the maxillary sinus when we look at this bone disarticulated. And then the palatine bone, if I go back to the articulated skull, the palatine bone is the posterior portion of the roof of the mouth, also part of the hard palate. And then the bone extends upward on either lateral side of the nose a little bit. So each bone of the palatine bone kind of looks like a capital L. And let's see if I can put these together properly. I don't know if I can. These might not be from the same side. I don't think they're from the same side. So if I look at the disarticulated palatine bone, it kind of looks like a capital L or a backwards capital L, depending on what side you're looking at. And the shorter end of the capital L is the part that is articulating with the palatine process of the maxilla bone. Okay, and when I look at the skull articulated, here is the palatine bone, and it also extends up this way toward the top part of the skull. So there's that upside down capital L. And then the other side is the other palatine bone. As mentioned previously, the zygomatic bone is your cheekbone. And the zygomatic bone features a projection that reaches back toward the temporal bone. So this projection is called the temporal process. And just a reminder as you're studying that this projection, which is part of the temporal bone, I'm on this side of the squiggly line, is the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. And then if I come to the anterior side of that squiggly line, this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone. So the projection is named for the other bone that the projection articulates with rather than the bone that it's a part of. And the zygomatic bone extends all the way up the side of the orbit and comes around to the front side of the face. Okay, the nasal bone are these small bones that make the bridge of your nose, and then the rest of your nose is made out of cartilage. The vomer is the bone that forms the lower half of your nasal septum. And vomer means plow, and if you look at it at kind of a sideways angle, you can see that it's very short at the very front of the nasal septum. But the vomer bone gets quite tall toward the back of the nasal cavities. And if I turn this around and we kind of look at this angle inside the nose, I can see the lateral masses and the perpendicular plate that is up there at the top, and all of this in the middle here from this reverse view, from this posterior view, is all vomer bone. The vomer is much taller from the back than it is from the front. And then to the sides here, this is the inferior nasal concha. And that means it's shaped like a conch shell, if we can look at it from the side. But it is lateral, and it's the lateral bumps that are lower in the nose. So lateral to the vomer rather than lateral to the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. But these are the inferior nasal conchae as a plural version. One is an inferior nasal concha. The last bone on this page of the lab manual is the lacrimal bone, and lacrimal means tear. So the lacrimal bone is going to be kind of behind the maxilla, 2 bones back from the nasal bone, and it's going to be right in that front medial corner of your eye where your tears come out. Okay, so this is the lacrimal bone, and the lacrimal bone has this passageway that I've put the stick into in its anterior and inferior corner, and that is called the nasolacrimal canal, and that's a passageway that connects your eye with your throat at the back of your nose, so your nasopharynx. And if you've ever given yourself eye drop medicine, and then 5 seconds later you can taste that medicine, the medicine has drained out of your eye, or part of it hopefully, has drained out of your eye through this nasolacrimal duct that runs through this canal in the skull. Nasolacrimal canal. And the very last bone associated with the face is the lower jawbone, which is your mandible. Okay, and it disarticulates from most of the skull models we have, so we can look at it all by itself. The alveolar processes, again, are the projections that stick out from the bone, wrapping around the roots of the teeth to form the sockets that your teeth sit in. So those are the alveolar processes, and kind of taken as a group, they can be called the alveolar part. So that's what that term means. The condyle of the mandible, or if I say that a different way, the mandibular condyle, is the smooth, rounded surface that will articulate with the mandibular fossa of the temporal bone. Okay, so that's the posterior most projection. And so it can also, because it sticks out so much from this bone, it can also be called the condylar process. So either mandibular condyle or condylar process. And then this almost looks like that side U profile of the trochlear notch of the ulna, if you remember that bone of the forearm. And so the condylar process, or mandibular condyle, on one end, And then this pointed projection that is more anterior has that same name as that projection did on the ulna. This is called the coronoid process. Coronoid process. And then the very last term that's listed in this set is the hyoid bone, and the hyoid bone is not part of the skull. The hyoid bone is the only bone in the human body that doesn't directly articulate with any other bone. It is suspended in your throat above your larynx, and this is a respiratory model that shows the larynx in the very top portion of the trachea. And the hyoid bone in this model is a little bigger than life size, but the hyoid bone is this single bone here. This model opens up to show you some respiratory structures, but the hyoid bone is just one bone. Hyoid means U-shaped, and if you look at the bone this way, it looks like a U. If you look at it from the anterior view, it kind of looks like a baby vampire jaw because of these little projections sticking up. And we don't learn the names of those processes, but those kind of make the hyoid bone to me look like a baby vampire jaw. Okay, so there's a representation of it. It is suspended by connective tissue above the larynx, and there are muscles connected to it above and below that move it around when you swallow, so we'll be learning the names of those muscles real soon. But the hyoid bone, we have a disarticulated one, I just don't have it with me, and then it's on a lot of the respiratory models suspended above the trachea.